The crimson sands of Kepler 442b stretched endlessly beneath twin suns, their light casting an ethereal glow across the alien landscape that had become Dr. Lyra Voss's personal hell. For 3 standard months, she had combed through the wreckage sites, analyzed atmospheric readings, and followed every faint signal that might lead her to her daughters. The transport vessel Aurora's Dream had vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine journey to the outer colonies, carrying with it her twin girls, Zara and Nova, aged 14. Lyra's weathered hands gripped the scanner as it emitted its familiar ping, indicating another false reading. The device had led her through crystalline caves, across toxic marshlands, and into the heart of sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone. Each disappointment carved deeper lines into her face, each dead end adding another sleepless night to her growing collection. The colonial authorities had declared the search officially concluded after 6 weeks, citing resource limitations and the vast improbability of survivors in such hostile terrain. But Lyra Voss had not traveled 47 light-years from Earth to accept bureaucratic defeat. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning, when her scanner detected an anomalous energy signature emanating from the Sorrow Peaks, a mountain range previously deemed uninhabitable due to its electromagnetic storms and unstable geology. The reading was unlike anything in her xenobiology databases, organic in nature, yet pulsing with an intelligence that seemed almost technological. Against the advice of her support AI and the warnings of local mineralogists, Lyra packed her emergency kit and began the treacherous ascent. The mountains rose like jagged teeth against the amber sky, their peaks shrouded in perpetual mist that interfered with most scanning equipment. Lyra's boots found precarious purchase on the sharp volcanic rock as she climbed higher, following the strengthening signal. The air grew thin, forcing her to rely on her oxygen recycler, while the temperature fluctuated wildly between scorching heat and bitter cold within the span of minutes. It was on the 3rd day of climbing that she first heard it, a sound that made her heart stop and restart in the same moment. Laughter. Human laughter, young and carefree, echoing from somewhere above. Lyra abandoned all caution, scrambling up the rock face with desperate energy. The sound grew clearer as she climbed, accompanied now by voices speaking in the familiar cadence of Earth Standard, though the words themselves were strange, filled with terms she had never heard. When she finally crested the ridge and saw what lay beyond, her scientific mind struggled to process the impossibility before her. A valley stretched below, lush and green despite the barren wasteland that surrounded the peaks. Bioluminescent trees swayed in a breeze that seemed to exist only within this hidden sanctuary, their leaves glowing with soft blue and purple light. Streams of crystal-clear water flowed in impossible directions, sometimes upward, sometimes forming perfect spirals in mid-air before rejoining their earthbound courses. And there, in the center of this alien paradise, was a figure that defied every law of physics Lyra had ever studied. The being stood nearly 3 meters tall, its form simultaneously solid and translucent, like living glass given shape and purpose. Its body seemed to be composed of the same energy that powered the scanner readings, flowing and shifting while maintaining a roughly humanoid appearance. Most remarkable of all, clinging to its massive arms and perched upon its shoulders, were 2 girls whose faces Lyra would have recognized across any galaxy. Zara and Nova appeared unharmed, their clothes somehow clean and intact despite months of absence. They spoke animatedly with their impossible guardian, gesturing excitedly at the floating streams and glowing flora around them. As Lyra watched in stunned silence, the being responded to their words with melodic sounds that seemed to resonate directly in her mind rather than through her ears. The girls laughed again, the sound that had guided her through the mountains, and the being's form shimmered with what could only be described as joy. Lyra called out, her voice cracking with emotion and disbelief. "Zara! Nova!" The twins turned, their eyes widening with surprise and delight. "Mom," they cried in unison, racing toward the ridge. But, as they ran, something extraordinary happened. The very ground beneath their feet began to reshape itself, forming a gentle slope that allowed them to reach her with impossible ease. Behind them, the towering being followed, its movements flowing like water uphill. The reunion was a chaos of tears, embraces, and rapid-fire questions. Lyra held her daughters close, checking them for injuries that weren't there, searching for signs of trauma that seemed completely absent. They appeared not only unharmed but somehow more vibrant than she remembered, their eyes bright with an inner light that matched the glow of their strange surroundings. "Mom, you have to meet Kieran," Nova said, tugging at her mother's arm. He saved us from the crash and brought us here. This place is amazing, the water tastes like music and the trees sing when you touch them. Zara nodded enthusiastically. He's been teaching us things, Mom. About energy and consciousness and how everything is connected. Did you know that thoughts have weight? Real, measurable weight? Lyra looked up at the being, Kieran, who had stopped a respectful distance away. Up close, she could see that his translucent form contained swirling patterns of light that pulsed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. When he spoke, the words formed directly in her mind, bypassing her ears entirely. Your offspring were damaged when I found them, Kieran communicated, his mental voice carrying undertones of deep compassion. The vessel's destruction caused trauma to their physical forms and consciousness. I have spent this time repairing what was broken, teaching them to understand the connections between matter and spirit that your species typically ignores. Lyra's scientific training warred with her maternal relief. What kind of being are you? How is this place possible? The energy readings, the impossible physics. I am what you might term a consciousness engineer, Kieran replied. My people exist primarily as organized energy, capable of manipulating matter and space through focused intention. This valley is a pocket dimension I created as a healing space for your daughters. They have learned much during their time here. As if to demonstrate, Zara extended her hand toward a nearby stream. The water responded to her gesture, forming a small spiral in the air that danced between her fingers before returning to its flow. Nova touched one of the glowing trees, and its entire canopy erupted in a symphony of color and sound that made Lyra gasp with wonder. We're different now, Mom, Zara said softly. Not just human anymore. Kieran says we're like bridges between two ways of existing. The implications crashed over Lyra like a tide. Her daughters had been changed, transformed by contact with an alien intelligence beyond human comprehension. The scientist in her was fascinated, the mother was terrified. What did this mean for their future? Could they ever return to normal human society? Did she even want them to, given what they had apparently gained? Part 2, the transformation of understanding. The days that followed Lyra's arrival in the Impossible Valley became a revelation that challenged everything she thought she knew about consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence itself. Kieran, with infinite patience, began to explain concepts that stretched the boundaries of human language and understanding. The twins served as eager translators, their newly expanded awareness allowing them to bridge the gap between their mother's scientific framework and the energy being's transcendent perspective. Consider, Kieran communicated one morning as they sat beside a stream that flowed in perfect geometric patterns through the air, that what you call matter is merely consciousness that has forgotten how to move freely. Your species has spent millennia studying the physical universe without recognizing that observation itself shapes reality at the quantum level. We simply extend that principle to its logical conclusion. Lyra watched her daughters manipulate the flowing water with casual gestures, their faces serene with concentration. But the energy requirements alone should make this impossible. The conservation of energy, the laws of thermodynamics apply within closed systems, Nova interrupted gently, her voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to resonate in Lyra's bones. But consciousness exists outside those boundaries. Kieran taught us that awareness itself is the fundamental force from which all others derive. Zara nodded, causing a cluster of luminescent flowers to bloom from bare stone with unconscious ease. Remember your quantum mechanics, Mom. The observer effect. Consciousness collapses probability waves into specific realities. We've just learned to do it intentionally instead of randomly. The scientific implications were staggering. If consciousness could indeed manipulate matter at the fundamental level, then everything from faster-than-light travel to the creation of matter from pure energy became theoretically possible. But the personal implications were even more profound. Her daughters were no longer entirely human in any conventional sense, and, with each passing day, they seemed to drift further from the world she knew. It was during one of these philosophical discussions that Lyra first noticed the changes in herself. She had been arguing a point about entropy when she realized that her words were creating small ripples in the air around her, visible distortions that matched the rhythm of her speech. When she mentioned this to Kieran, his form brightened with what she had learned to recognize as approval. Proximity to expanded consciousness has effects, he explained. Your offspring required extensive reconstruction after their trauma, which opened their awareness permanently. Your contact with them and this environment is beginning to activate dormant potentials within your own neural structure. The revelation that humans possessed latent psychic abilities that could be awakened through contact with beings like Kiran sent Lyra's mind reeling. She began to understand why her daughters seemed so comfortable with their transformation. They weren't becoming aliens so much as becoming more fully themselves. The crash that had nearly killed them had, paradoxically, liberated them from the limitations that normally constrained human consciousness. But liberation came with its own challenges. As Lyra's own abilities began to manifest, first as an enhanced empathic sensitivity, then, as a gradually developing ability to influence local electromagnetic fields, she found herself facing a profound crisis of identity. The rational, methodical scientist who had spent her life studying the universe from the outside was being invited to participate in its creation at the most fundamental level. The crisis came to a head during what Kiran called a resonance storm, a natural phenomenon that occurred when the pocket dimension's energy fields reached critical alignment with the broader cosmic background. The valley filled with cascading waves of visible sound and audible light as reality became temporarily fluid. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, but, for Lyra it represented something more troubling, a complete breakdown of the orderly, predictable universe she had always inhabited. She found herself paralyzed with fear as the storm intensified, her newly awakened consciousness recoiling from the chaos of unlimited possibility. The trees sang crystalline notes that painted geometric patterns in the air while the streams became ribbons of liquid music that danced between dimensions. Her daughters moved through this chaos with fluid grace, their forms occasionally becoming translucent as they synchronized with the valley's energy flows. But Lyra could only stand frozen, overwhelmed by the dissolution of everything she had believed about the nature of reality. It was Kiran who approached her during the storm's peak, his massive form somehow providing an island of stability in the chaos. You resist the transformation because you fear losing yourself, he observed, his mental voice gentle but unwavering. But consider this: what you call self is largely composed of limitations and fears that you have mistaken for identity. To become more than you were, you must be willing to release who you think you are. The words echoed a phrase that had been nagging at Lyra's subconscious since her arrival: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. She had always interpreted it as a metaphor for personal growth and resilience, but, here in this impossible place, surrounded by proof that consciousness could reshape reality itself, she began to understand its deeper meaning. Her weak self was the part of her that insisted on remaining safely within the boundaries of conventional understanding, that preferred the comfort of limitation to the terrifying freedom of unlimited potential. It was the aspect of her consciousness that would rather cling to familiar suffering than risk the unknown possibilities that lay beyond her current identity. As this realization crystallized, Lyra felt something fundamental shift within her awareness. The fear that had paralyzed her began to transform into curiosity, then, into a wild exhilaration as she finally allowed herself to fully perceive the storm's beauty. The chaotic patterns revealed themselves as part of a vast, cosmic symphony, and she found that by releasing her need to understand and control, she could participate in its flow. When she finally let go of her resistance, the change was immediate and profound. Her consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of her physical form, merging temporarily with the valley's energy matrix. For a timeless moment, she experienced existence from Kiran's perspective, aware of the intricate connections between all things, capable of sensing the flow of information and energy that comprised the true structure of reality. The storm passed, leaving the valley transformed once again. New formations of crystal and light had appeared, growing from the seeds of possibility that had been scattered during the chaos. But the most significant transformation was in Lyra herself. She could feel the difference in every cell of her body, in every thought and perception. She was still recognizably herself, but her sense of what was possible had expanded beyond all previous limitations. Her daughters approached her with expressions of joy and relief. They had watched her struggle with the transformation, unable to help but offering their love and support through the crisis. Now they could sense the change in her consciousness, the opening that allowed her to truly understand their own journey. "Welcome to the next phase of human evolution," Zara said softly, her words carrying layers of meaning that Lyra could now perceive directly. Nova added, "Now we can show you what Kiran has been teaching us about building bridges between worlds." Part 3, The Bridge Between Worlds. The final phase of their journey began with a revelation that would reshape not only their own lives but, potentially, the future of human consciousness itself. Kiran had been preparing them for something far greater than personal transformation. He was training them to become ambassadors between dimensions of existence that had remained separate for millennia. "Your species stands at a crucial junction," Kiran explained as they gathered in the valley's central grove, where the bioluminescent trees formed a perfect circle around a pool of liquid starlight. "The expansion into space has brought you into contact with consciousness forms that your current paradigm cannot accommodate. Without evolution of awareness, contact will result in fear, conflict, and, ultimately, destruction." Lyra absorbed this information with her newly expanded perception, seeing not just the words but the vast network of probability threads that extended from this moment into countless possible futures. In some timelines, humanity remained isolated within its limited understanding, eventually stagnating and declining. In others, contact with beings like Kiran led to war and catastrophe as fear overwhelmed wisdom. But, in a precious few, she could see a path where humanity learned to transcend its limitations and join a larger community of conscious beings. "You want us to be the bridge," she realized. "To demonstrate that humans can evolve beyond their current constraints without losing their essential nature." The twins nodded in unison, their consciousness now so synchronized that they sometimes spoke as a single entity. "We've been learning to translate between different forms of awareness," they said, their combined voice creating harmonics that painted visible patterns in the air. "Kiran's people exist primarily as organized energy, but they remember what it was like to have physical form. They can teach us how to maintain our humanity while expanding our consciousness." Over the following weeks, their training intensified. Kiran introduced them to concepts that had no equivalent in human language, methods of perceiving reality through multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously, techniques for communicating with consciousness forms that existed as pure information, and, most importantly, ways to anchor their expanded awareness while returning to normal space. The process was not without risks. During one particularly intensive session, Lyra found her consciousness scattered across multiple probability threads, experiencing dozens of potential timelines simultaneously. For several terrifying hours, she existed as pure possibility, unable to consolidate her awareness back into a singular identity. It was only through the combined efforts of her daughters and Kiran that she managed to return to coherent selfhood, but the experience taught her crucial lessons about the nature of personal identity and the discipline required to maintain it while operating at expanded levels of awareness. The twins faced their own challenges, particularly as their human nature began to feel increasingly foreign to their expanded consciousness. There were days when they struggled to remember why physical existence mattered, when the limitations of flesh and bone seemed like arbitrary constraints that could be discarded at will. Lyra became their anchor during these episodes, reminding them of the beauty and significance of human experience while supporting their growth beyond conventional limitations. It was during one such episode that they made their most significant breakthrough. Nova had become lost in a state of pure energy consciousness, her physical form flickering in and out of visibility as she struggled to remember why she should maintain material existence. Zara was attempting to reach her through direct consciousness contact, but their merged awareness was pulling her into the same dispersed state. Lyra, watching her daughters fade from physical reality, experienced a moment of primal terror that cut through all her expanded understanding. In that instant of pure maternal love and protective instinct, something crystallized within her consciousness. She reached out with her awareness, but instead of trying to expand beyond her humanity as she had been trained to do, she embraced it fully, her fears, her limitations, her fierce attachment to her physical daughters. The result was extraordinary. Her consciousness became a stable anchor point that allowed her daughters to return to their bodies without losing the expanded awareness they had gained. She had discovered the secret that Kiran's people had been searching for: how to maintain transcendent consciousness while remaining grounded in material existence through the power of love and attachment. "This is why we needed humans," Kiran communicated, his form blazing with excitement and revelation. "My people transcended physical existence so completely that we lost the ability to bridge between dimensions of being. We can expand consciousness, but we cannot anchor it in material reality without losing our transcendent nature. You have found the way to exist fully in both states simultaneously." The implications rippled through their understanding like waves in the liquid starlight pool. Humanity's supposed weaknesses, their emotional attachments, their resistance to complete transcendence, their stubborn insistence on maintaining individual identity, were actually their greatest strengths. These qualities would allow them to serve as living bridges between purely physical and purely energetic forms of consciousness. As their training neared completion, Karen began preparing them for the journey back to human space. The pocket dimension that had served as their sanctuary and school would remain accessible, but they would need to demonstrate their abilities in the wider universe. Their first mission would be to make contact with other expanded consciousness forms that existed in local space, beings that had been observing human expansion with growing concern. The departure was both triumphant and bittersweet. The valley had become more than a refuge, it was the birthplace of a new form of human consciousness. As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave, Lyra reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed. They were still a family, still recognizably themselves, but they had become something unprecedented, humans who could exist comfortably in multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. Kieran's final gift to them was a small device that looked like a sphere of crystallized starlight. When activated, it would allow them to create temporary pocket dimensions of their own, spaces where other humans could be safely introduced to expanded consciousness concepts without the trauma that the twins had experienced during their crash. "Your work begins now," he communicated as the valley around them began to fade, returning them to the harsh reality of Kepler 442b's surface. Other consciousness forms throughout this galaxy have been waiting for a bridge species to emerge. You will face resistance from your own kind, fear and misunderstanding from those who prefer the safety of limitation. But you have learned the most important lesson, that true strength comes not from destroying your limitations, but from transcending them while maintaining your essential nature. As they materialized on the mountainside where Lyra's ship waited, she looked at her daughters with wonder and pride. They had all been transformed by their experience, but they remained fundamentally human. The love that bound them as a family had become the foundation for a new form of consciousness that could bridge any gap, overcome any limitation. The journey back to the colonial settlements was quiet, each of them processing the magnitude of what lay ahead. They were no longer simply a xenobiologist and her daughters, they were pioneers of human consciousness, ambassadors to forms of existence that most people couldn't even imagine. The path would not be easy, there would be skeptics to convince, fears to overcome, and entirely new paradigms of science and philosophy to establish. But, as their ship lifted off from Kepler 442b's surface, carrying them toward their uncertain future, Lyra knew with absolute certainty that they were ready for the challenge. They had found each other across impossible distances, survived transformation that should have destroyed them, and learned to maintain their humanity while transcending its limitations. Whatever awaited them in the vast cosmos of conscious beings, they would face it together, as a family that had learned to exist in multiple dimensions of love and awareness simultaneously. The weak selves they had been limited by fear, constrained by conventional understanding, bound by the illusion of separation, had been transformed through love into something stronger than any external force could destroy. They were living proof that evolution and transcendence did not require the abandonment of what made them human, but rather the full embrace and expansion of their deepest nature. Their story was just beginning, but it would be written across the stars themselves, a testament to the power of consciousness to transform limitation into unlimited possibility while never losing sight of the love that makes existence meaningful. In finding her lost daughters, Lyra had discovered not just a family reunited, but a new future for humanity itself, one where the bridges between worlds would be built not from technology or force, but from the infinite capacity of consciousness to love and transcend while remaining eternally, beautifully human. End of document. Final analysis and implications. This account represents the first documented case of successful human consciousness expansion through contact with transdimensional entities. The subjects, Dr. Lyra Voss and her daughters Zara and Nova, demonstrate that human awareness can be enhanced beyond conventional limitations while maintaining core identity and emotional bonds. Their experience suggests that humanity's evolutionary path may involve transcending physical constraints through consciousness development rather than technological advancement alone. The entity known as Kiran represents a form of organized energy consciousness that appears to exist across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. The technology and abilities demonstrated in the pocket dimension exceed current human understanding by several orders of magnitude, yet remain accessible through consciousness training rather than mechanical devices. Most significantly, this account provides evidence that human consciousness possesses latent capabilities that can be activated through specific circumstances and training. The phrase, "the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," emerges not as metaphor but as literal description of consciousness transformation, the replacement of limiting self-concepts with expanded awareness that maintains essential identity while transcending conventional constraints. The implications for human development, space exploration, and contact with non-human intelligence forms are profound and require immediate scientific investigation and philosophical consideration. Document classified pending review by Consciousness Studies Division and Xenobiology Council.